Opioids. We're here to talk about opioids. It's really the big thing going on now for a number of years. But as Rabbi Gluck mentioned, we shouldn't forget about other very serious addictions. About 100,000 people a year die of alcoholism in the United States. And the number one addiction in terms of public health and death is tobacco addiction. It's hard to believe this, but 450,000 people a year in America die of tobacco-related diseases, whether it's lung cancer, heart disease, bronchitis, etc. So this is the beautiful opium poppy plant, usually growing someplace in Afghanistan and that area of the world. Many of you probably have different varieties of poppy plants growing in your gardens. They're perennials, they bloom every spring. A number of different colors on the flowers, red, orange, white. And when the flowers fall off, you're left with what's called a seed pod. And when you cut into the seed pod, shortly after the flower falls off, it's called the unripened seed pod. You get that kind of milky, grayish, brownish fluid coming out. That's raw opium. And in that opium is morphine and codeine. And as you probably know, people smoke opium and use opium, but it was the morphine that was refined in that opium that became the drug pharmaceutical drug, and heroin is made from morphine coming out of the opium poppy plant. If, on the other hand, you let the seed pod ripen and you don't cut into it and then you shake it out later, you get poppy seeds. When you eat either a bagel or cake with poppy seeds on it, the poppy seeds are coming from the opium poppy plants in Asia, and it is possible to test positive for opiates from eating a bagel with a lot of poppy seeds on it that has a content of morphine and codeine. So that can happen. Heroin, again, which is made from the morphine that comes out of the poppy plant in labs near where the plants are grown, heroin is actually a branded name from the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, the same people that make Bayer aspirin. So way back in the late 1800s, the only medications that were available were chemicals that came out of plants, like morphine out of the poppy plant, cocaine from the coca plant, marijuana. These were the drugs that people used for diarrhea, for stomach aches, for pain. And a lot of people were becoming addicted to the morphine that they were buying in what were then called drugstores. And so Bayer Pharmaceuticals said, we have a solution to this problem. We've made heroin, and that will solve the morphine problem. But of course that didn't do it, because heroin is more potent than morphine and does exactly the same thing. But it's interesting that that's a branded product. And there were a number of different heroin products. This is called glycoheroin, a cough syrup, and it says the problem has been solved, which was the morphine addiction problem. Now, in addition to the cough medicine and other products, there was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was morphine, and it had 10 milligrams per teaspoon, and 10 milligrams is a pretty reasonable dose of morphine. But again, these were the medicines that were available for children's teething. Now, whenever I see this, I always think the same thing. I think I'm on an airplane, and maybe there's a little baby who is teething, and the kid is screaming and screaming the whole flight. And would it be so terrible if you said to the attendant, do you happen to have any Mrs. Winslow soothing syrup on board? Okay. I thought I'd start that and see if people were going to laugh at anything. Maybe they won't. That was supposed to be a little bit humorous. Talking about opioids now. So this is prescription opioids for pain. This is the United States. And then you can see all the other countries here. Our beloved Israel is over here, way down here. But you can see in many of these very developed Western nations, they don't use nearly as much prescription painkillers as we do in the United States. When it comes to a drug like hydrocodone, which you probably know as Vicodin or Norco, we use approximately 90% of the hydrocodone produced in the world. And really the question, I don't have the answer to it, is, why are we such an outlier over here where we're almost double, our closest competitor here, Canada, and the other Western nations. And there are a lot of different reasons that people think they should never be in pain, that there's a pill for everything that's wrong with people, and part of our culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pain issue and opioids, and then we're going to go back to heroin and opioid addiction, but they're interrelated. And this is really how the whole opioid addiction problem got started over the last 10 or 15 years, and that is with the increased amounts of prescription opioids that were being prescribed. So here's just a really simple demonstration of what went wrong. This is 10 years, 2000, 2010. These are the sales of prescription opioids. They quadrupled. Deaths from prescription opioid overdose deaths quadrupled, and people entering treatment for opioid use disorder also quadrupled. And you say to yourself, how could there have been such an increase in pain in America in 10 years? And there's a complicated answer. It had to do with the pharmaceutical marketing and a number of other issues that sort of created a perfect storm. And this is an important slide that kind of puts it all together as well. So now we're going 2000 to 2014. These are all the opioid overdose deaths from any kind of opioid. But we've really had three epidemics within the epidemic. The first epidemic was the prescription opioids, and that's the prescription opioid line with almost a quadrupling over this period of time. And then what happened was a number of measures were put into place to try to get physicians and other providers to prescribe less opioids. There was more and more education. There was something called the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, where if you come to me and I'm going to give you an opioid, I can look you up and see all the prescriptions that you've gotten for the past year for any controlled medications, opioids, benzodiazepines, and that was supposed to cut down on you being able to go to a number of different doctors and get different prescriptions for opioids from different doctors. And so since 2010, the rate of opioid prescribing has gone down. So now people who were physically dependent or addicted on these prescription opioids were having a hard time finding them. The doctors weren't prescribing as much. When they were buying it on the street, the price went up, and the people who deal in heroin, they made the availability of heroin very easy to obtain, and they reduced the cost drastically. So the patients I see tell me there's about a 10-to-1 ratio between the cost of heroin and the cost of pills. So for example, if you spent $1 on heroin, it would have to be $10 for an oxycodone to match that heroin. So naturally, people shifted over to heroin, and that's the blue line. And since 2010, there's been a very steep increase in heroin use, heroin misuse, addiction, and overdoses related to heroin. And if that were not bad enough, the third part of the epidemic, which we're in right now, and it's the worst part by far, was the introduction of fentanyl, which is a very potent opioid, and I'll show you the potencies in a moment. Anyone using heroin in the United States now should assume that either what they're really buying is all fentanyl or the heroin is contaminated with the fentanyl. It's much harder to prevent an overdose with fentanyl than it is with either heroin or prescription opioids. And this fentanyl problem is just incredible. I have some information about that, I think, coming up. So this is sort of another summary slide. This is 2016. They're saying about 64,000 people will die of a drug overdose, and most of that is opioids. That's a very, very high number. The last number I heard was that 140 people a day in America die of an opioid overdose. A couple of months ago, it was 91. Now I'm hearing 140. Now let me show you that car crashes, automobile deaths. The highest it ever got to was in 1972, and it was at this level. This is the peak HIV death rate in 1995, is that? And here's the guns, murder by guns. So you can see that the opioids now have surpassed these other epidemics. Actually, Dr. Gluck made reference to that these other things are important, but now the opioid epidemic is even worse than all these other things that we talk much more about. So here's a nice way to look at it. This is considered to be a lethal or an overdose amount of heroin. This amount of heroin. It would take this amount of fentanyl to overdose with, and like 1 or 2 little grains of carfentanil to overdose with. And fentanyl now, as I said, is in all the heroin, and across the country there are also outbreaks of people being exposed to carfentanil. So if morphine, which is what we use as the standard, is a 1, heroin is twice as potent, fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine, which means that when you take it, it creates 100 times more of, let's say, respiratory depression where you can't breathe, or you become sedated or comatose. And this number is just hard to believe, that carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent. You may have read about that. They call that the elephant tranquilizer. So you got an elephant, I forget, I think elephants weigh like 2 or 3 tons or 4 tons, I don't know. You know, they're real big, you know that. And you got to have a drug like carfentanil with that kind of potency to sedate an elephant. And I think what Rabbi Gluck may have been alluding to in that ambulance worker, if you get 1 or 2 grains of this fentanyl on your skin where it can be absorbed, it can cause an overdose. Now, where does fentanyl and carfentanil, where's it coming from? It's being made in laboratories, primarily in China, some in Mexico, and it's being shipped into the United States. And think of it from the drug dealer's point of view. If you're going to sell heroin, you know, you got to cut into those seed pods, you got to get the opium, you got to add different chemicals, and you got to make heroin, and then you have to package the heroin and ship it. Now you can make something fentanyl, which is going to take up much less volume, and you don't have to do all that agricultural work or the carfentanil. So from the point of view of the drug dealer, this is a much better business to be in because it's much less work, it's much cheaper to produce, and it's easier to bring in because of the small volumes that are involved. So in the New York Times on Friday, there was an article about the production of fentanyl in China, and it mentioned a website, this one over here, and you know, I kept the article, and today, before I came here, although I was a little hesitant using the hospital internet to go on there and look for this, because I'm thinking people must be monitoring who's looking for it, you know. But it said in the paper that this website closed down fentanyl, but then the next sentence said, if you just spell it a little bit differently, you can still find it. So instead of spelling it with a Y, I spelled it with an I, fentanyl with an I and not a Y. And here it is. So God knows how this works. I was afraid to go any further and click anything else on this thing. But apparently you can go on this thing and order carfentanil and fentanyl and somehow get it shipped to you. And there were a couple other websites mentioned in that New York Times article. And I think I heard someplace along the way that President Trump did talk to President Xi about this when he was in China, because this is where it's coming from China. Now, what about New York City, where we live? Well, you guys are doing okay here. As Forest Hill's probably someplace in here, right? Kind of for Queens. Am I in the right area, kind of? No, yes? You don't know either? Okay. The worst places are areas in Staten Island and areas of the Bronx. These are all overdoses, and these are heroin overdoses. The hottest areas are up in the Bronx, near Montefiore Hospital, Lower Bronx, and for some reason, Staten Island has always been an epicenter in New York of the opioid overdose epidemic. So you have a terrible problem, which Dr. Gluck spelled out, but compared to other neighborhoods and other areas of the city, there are worse problems there. This is the United States. The yellow circles reflect the amount of prescription opioids prescribed in that state. So the bigger the circle, the more prescription opioids. The darkness of the blue represents overdose deaths. The darker the blue, the more overdoses. And you can see that in general, the more opioids being prescribed in a state will reflect more overdoses in that state. And this is what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years. The hardest hit part of the country has always been Appalachia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. They've been hit the hardest. The whole coal industry has collapsed, and there are a lot of other different reasons, but New Hampshire has had a problem, Ohio has had a problem. In New York, we've been relatively light. In other words, we have a huge problem, but compared to other places, we don't have as much of a problem. So here's New York City with fentanyl, and they're trying to do a public health thing. Fentanyl is killing New Yorkers. Now, not only is fentanyl being sold as heroin, but people are making pills of, let's say, oxycodone or Vicodin. They're selling those pills illicitly, and it's fentanyl. They're pressing fentanyl into pills and selling them as Xanax, Vicodin, and so people are buying those thinking they're getting Xanax or Vicodin, and they're getting fentanyl. Fentanyl is also being mixed in with cocaine, which is a big problem because people who use opioids chronically develop an opioid tolerance. They're not as likely to overdose as somebody who is opiate naive. So if you think you're buying cocaine and you're actually buying fentanyl, you're very likely to overdose and die because you have no tolerance. So this is New York City. They're saying cocaine is laced with fentanyl. In 2016, 37% of overdose deaths involved cocaine and fentanyl without heroin. That's amazing. And over 1,000 New Yorkers died in 2016. First time it went over 1,000 ever in the city. Where are people getting these drugs? And that has something to do with you folks out here. The red bars are people getting them for free from a friend or a relative. So people are getting the prescriptions and then they're sharing it with other people. By the way, that's illegal. It's technically a felony to share any controlled substances with other people. However, if people really get addicted to these prescription medications, they can get them less and less from friends and relatives because they're just not enough, they're taking too much to be able to get it from one person. Then they have to find a doctor or prescriber or get it illegally. But the message for this is that don't share any of these medications with anyone, and when you're done with them, dispose of them, get rid of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. People have all kinds of different surgery, orthopedic surgery, urology, all kinds of cesarean section. Generally speaking, when people have surgery, when they go home, they're given a prescription for opioids, either oxycodone or hydrocodone or any opioid, but they're given a prescription. It turns out that in general, 80% of the prescription that they're given is never used, which is another problem, that providers, doctors, dentists are prescribing too much of these opioids for acute pain after surgery when usually only a couple of days is really needed. People go to the dentist, they have a dental extraction, they sometimes leave with 30 oxycodones when they don't need any, or one or two. And so these things hanging around the house, particularly if you have teenagers in the house, become a source of opioids that people get into trouble with. Now, 2 years ago, I had my left hip replaced. And while I was in the hospital, I took one oxycodone because the nurse said, you better take it, you're gonna have physical therapy, you're gonna be in a lot of pain. I was never, ever in a lot of pain. And I only took one, and when I take an oxycodone, like most people, I got dizzy, I got nauseous. I said, it's not even helping me that much with the pain, I don't feel good, I wish I hadn't taken it. But when I left the hospital, they gave me a prescription for 100 of them. Why did I fill it? I figure I got to tell you why I filled it, because it doesn't make sense if I knew I didn't need it that I filled it. Because everybody was telling me that when you leave the hospital, less than 48 hours, you're going to have physical therapy come to the house, and boy, that's going to be really, really painful. You better have some oxycodone. And it wasn't painful. It was okay. So anyway, that's just an example of overprescribing. So, you know, now in New York State, there's a law. You cannot get more than 7 days of an opioid prescription for acute pain. Acute pain means that you broke your ankle, or you had a dental extraction, or you had a kidney stone. Now, the other times when opioids are used for pain, cancer pain, end-of-life care, palliative care, no one has an issue with that because the implied idea is that this is going to be time-limited. This is not going to go on for that long. That people are suffering, not so much with pain, but just from existential suffering. And so people say that that's okay. This is where the problem went bad 15 years ago, that we started to say any pain that somebody has, they have a backache, they have headaches, fibromyalgia, give them opioids, keep them on it forever, and things will work out. And that didn't turn out to be true, and that resulted in this opioid epidemic, or at least was a good part of it. So you may have heard about something called abuse deterrent or tamper-resistant opioids. OxyContin, which I'm thinking you've heard about, is blamed as the major reason this whole opioid epidemic came about, along with its manufacturer, Purdue Pharma. And you were able to crush those pills and take a long-acting medication, make it short-acting, and inject it and sniff it. So they came out with a tamper-resistant formulation in 2010, where you could no longer crush the pill. What happened was that the sales of OxyContin went down, the use went down, and a mirror image increase in heroin. And again, people were physically dependent. They needed to be on an opioid, so they couldn't use the OxyContin the way they were doing it anymore. The heroin was more available, cheaper, and people blame the whole OxyContin thing for the heroin epidemic as well. So what's next? Because I like Dr. Gluck's optimism that we're going to, through all these different efforts, wipe this all out off the face of the earth. And that would be great if it could happen, but it's not going to happen. And the opioid epidemic will eventually get better, but something's going to take its place. And the DEA is already seeing increased production and imports of cocaine coming into the country and increased reports of use of cocaine. And now one of the things that I think happens is that young people, a bunch of young people here today, young people did not grow up, the young people today who are using heroin did not grow up when I was growing up way back in the 50s and the 60s, where heroin had the worst reputation of anything in terms of stigma. It was inner city, it was minority, it was criminal, it was injections, it was prison, it was horrible. So there were a lot of recreational drugs around in the 60s and the 70s, but I never saw heroin. But I'm thinking like younger people who don't know all about that, look at heroin, it's a powder, you can sniff it, you relax, it doesn't make you crazy, and think, you know, like, hey, why not? Why is it any different than having a glass of vodka? And I think the same thing may happen now with the cocaine, because the 80s are going to be a distant memory for, I guess, the millennials today. But the way that Dr. Gluck and I are talking about opioids today, all we talked about in the 80s was cocaine and crack cocaine. That was it. We didn't talk about opioids. Only cocaine, only crack babies, only what's going to be with these babies who are born to mothers using cocaine and addicted. Sports people were dying, Hollywood people were dying. It's really incredible how there are these cycles of addiction in America, and they usually go from a stimulant drug to a more sedating drug. So I want to do a little bit about what happens in the brain. What is addiction? So this has been mentioned a little bit. Chronic brain disease, generally progressive, not curable. You can't cure addiction, but you can treat it and put it into remission. Can't cure asthma, can't cure blood pressure, can't cure arthritis. All the chronic diseases can be treated but not cured. That's why AA says, I'm in recovery, I'm a recovering alcoholic. They never say recovered. It's a disease that does have, unfortunately, relapses and remissions. It's treatable. You may need a lot of different kinds of people to help with the treatment. How do you define addiction? I'm telling you, it can be complicated, but it's also simple. It's continued use of an activity. So now it's beyond drugs. It could be gambling, it could be food, it could be sex, it could be internet, it could be anything, despite knowledge of continued harm to oneself or others. So use despite harm. If you think you're addicted to X, if there's no harm, you just can't be addicted. Say, I'm addicted to chocolate. Well, unless it's harming you in some way, people just throw that word around, addicted, all the time. I'm addicted to The Sopranos or another TV show. Unless there's harm, there's no addiction. Now, what is addiction? You never do what addicted people do, or do you? You do. We have to use the same circuits in the brain that addicted people use in order to stay alive and have anything we call an enjoyable, reasonable life. And a great example has already been mentioned a number of times, alcohol. Now, I've been drinking alcohol for 50 years socially. Never in any of that time did I ever say to myself, oh boy, I'm really worried. I think I'm going to become alcohol dependent. I never had that thought because I am not vulnerable to alcohol addiction. And yet that same liquid, the vodka, the bourbon, whatever it is is causing so much grief for alcohol-dependent people and their family and friends, and the car accidents and the violence and everything else. So it can't be the vodka, right? It has to be something in the person that creates the addiction. And what I found is that if I spent enough time talking to people who were addicted, I could understand why it happened to them. It was logical and rational from their point of view, from inside their brain. Not from my brain, but from inside their brain. It made sense. And that to me was a big breakthrough, that there was a way to understand why people became addicted. Now, why do people use drugs? I've got a glass of Coca-Cola here. I may have it during the talk, I may not. But if I go to a big social event, I may expect to have a glass of alcohol. I could have Coca-Cola there too, and you could have Coca-Cola, but I'm sure, well, many of you are probably social alcohol users. 75% of people in America are. So why, well, we'll come back to why I have the alcohol in a moment. But anyway, these are the reasons that people are using drugs. Change how they feel, make social interactions a little bit more fun, a little bit easier, etc. Right? I mean, people don't use these drugs for no reason. They use it for certain reasons that usually works out okay. Now, most people, when they go to a big party, a big simcha, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, I was at the Chazak event when Mrs. Gurgov and her family were on it a couple of years ago at Terrasanda Park. I would say there was a pretty reasonable amount of alcohol at that Chazak event, and that I did enjoy having a few drinks. If you walk into an event like that Chazak event that the rabbi spoke about in December, let's say there was no open bar and no alcohol at the event at all. Most of you would have two reactions to that. One would be surprise, and the other one would be disappointment, because you'd be expecting to have a couple of drinks. Even though there'd be soda there, there'd be water which you could have, but you want the alcohol to do something in your brain that water and Coca-Cola can't do. And you've learned that as you've gotten older and come through and been acculturated to the alcohol. It'll relax you in a certain way. It'll make you a little bit euphoric, a little happier, a little something that you're looking for. And there's nothing wrong with that, and we call that social use of alcohol. So Mrs. Gurgov and I thought that maybe there'd be a lot of parents here with kids. And one of the things I know that's difficult for everyone is to understand addiction, because it's so counterintuitive, this disease of addiction. And what I mean by that is if somebody would just stop taking the heroin, the problem would go away, or stop drinking the alcohol, go away. And yet the essence of addiction is that they can't do that. They can't stop even though they know it's causing harm. That's the definition. That's the conundrum of addiction. So very often people get angry because they think the person is voluntarily not stopping when it's involuntary. And they get annoyed with the person and angry. And I'm frequently sitting in a room with the patient, let's say a young 20-year-old and parents, and I frequently use the food addiction paradigm. Now, this is an addiction or a problem that I can identify with and have. I stopped eating, I think it was after 20 pieces of the sushi. I said, okay, I got to stop now, I'm done, even though I could knock off all 4 platters, and Mrs. Gurgov has actually witnessed that, a survivor of that witnessing. But anyway, you're sitting there with people, 2/3 of people in America are overweight or obese, 2/3. It's the biggest public health problem now in America. All you have to do to lose weight is eat less and exercise more. That's all you have to do. I've been trying to lose 15 pounds for a long time now. I can't do it. Every morning I get up, I think today's going to be the day, I'm going to do it. And I don't do it. Why don't I do it? Because of the pathways I'm going to show you in a minute, that somehow or other the food becomes very important to me, and once it starts, it can't stop. I spoke to a patient today in one of our units that Christine and I work in, and he said, yeah, every time I drink, I black out. I said, well, why can't you stop after 1 or 2 drinks? And he says, once I start, I just can't stop. I got to keep going until I black out. And I can't understand it with alcohol. I can't, because I would never do that. But I could certainly understand it with bagels or with donuts, that once it gets going, there's no stopping it until it's too much. However, it's much easier to not start, right? As long as the bag of potato chips stays closed, then everything's okay. But once it's open and you take one, that's it. goodbye for the bag. It can't be stopped after that. So anyway, I like telling people, you know, think about food. Why can't you lose weight? So here it is. I shouldn't, but I'm going to have the garbage. This is the essence of food addiction, where you know you don't want to eat it, but you eat it anyway. Okay, so we got to talk a little bit about the brain. We call this what we call a sagittal section. It would be as if somebody came and, you know, cut my head this way and you were seeing a side view of my head. We humans have a very big cortex, and that's where we do philosophy and daven and think about God and do all kinds of things up here, and mathematical equations. But we have another part of the brain called, I'm going to call it the limbic system for today. And that's the part of the brain that is impacted by addictive substances. Most of the studies on addiction have been done on rats. You can't stick needles and tubes into people's brains, but you can into rat brains. And then it turns out that Mother Nature has preserved this limbic system part of the brain identically in rats, in dogs, in humans, in monkeys. Exactly the same anatomy, exactly the same physiology. And it turns out, because I think everyone has heard of the word dopamine, that whenever you do something that's pleasurable to you, dopamine gets released in a part of the brain. We call it the nucleus accumbens. It doesn't matter. And when the dopamine gets released, you have a good feeling from that. And it turns out that all the drugs that people use for a lifetime, like alcohol, that's alcohol, and misuse, abuse, and have all kinds of problems with, all work in that part of the brain, causing release of dopamine. And when the dopamine's released, there's a euphoric feeling. So why would Mother Nature preserve this part of the brain so identically in all animals? Because it's also called, oh, it's a little blocked, the pleasure reward center of the brain. And the way Mother Nature, or maybe in this audience, Hashem has this rigged up, is that when you eat when you're hungry, when you drink when you're thirsty, when you have children, when you raise children, when you socialize with people, those activities are programmed to feel good. And the reason that they feel good is they cause dopamine to be released in the nucleus accumbens. Then these chemicals can come in and cause more dopamine to be released than the natural rewards. And one saying that we have is that these drugs can hijack the brain. So when we say that addiction is a brain disease, what we mean is that it changes this part of the brain, the limbic system. So the natural rewards, like family, school, stuff like that, is not as important or pleasurable to the person as getting the heroin or the cocaine or the alcohol. That becomes what seems to be the survival that I need. I've got to get more alcohol in order to survive because it has entrenched itself in these particular circuits of the brain. So that part of the brain has a certain neurochemical output. You've got dopamine in there, serotonin, and I'm thinking you've heard of these neurotransmitters, but all of these molecules in your brain, the final output of that part of your brain creates your hedonic tone. So right now, as we sit in the room here, each one of you knows what your hedonic tone is, your sense of being happy, pleasure, well-being. I'm enjoying this. I hope you guys are. If you are, then your hedonic tone is okay. If you have someplace else to be or you're worried about something, your hedonic tone is not going to be that good. But your hedonic tone or sense of pleasure and happiness is set in that limbic system. Sometimes people want to be very euphoric. Nobody wants to ever be very dysphoric. Dr. Gluck mentioned a number of issues that make people dysphoric, unhappy, miserable. And in my experience, people who go on to become addicted never see that dysphoria going away. Most of us, you know, go up and down in our lives with hedonic tone, but we know when we take a hit into hedonic tone, we just don't do anything stupid. It'll come back, we'll feel better again. The next day will be better than it was today, and things will be okay again. But addicted people don't see it. They only see the dysphoria with no improvement in that, and they're not going to feel better. And we know that hedonic tone is altered by psychoactive activities. That's why those of you who are social drinkers drink alcohol, to change how you feel. It's a delicate balance. You can be having a good day, and then all of a sudden something terrible happens. So where should hedonic tone come from? Well, we got to have sources that are safe, durable, productive, and dependable. It's already been mentioned, family, wonderful source of hedonic tone. Hopefully, if you have a good family. Work is so important. I get so much of my hedonic tone from my work, from what I do with the patients, from traveling, from lecturing, from reading, from gaining new knowledge, etc. Education. You know, I get calls from my colleagues. I got a 14-year-old kid. He's using some alcohol and marijuana. You know, what do you think? Is it a problem or not? And I ask two questions. Is your kid basically a happy kid or not? And he'll say, oh, the kid's really happy, he gets along with everybody, we're having no problems with him. And then I'll say, what about school? Getting straight A's, he's planning on going to college, he wants to be an engineer. Or they'll say, no, he hates school, he's going to drop out, he's getting straight F's. If they say the kid is basically happy, enjoying school, say, look, this is recreational drug use. What used to happen when I was growing up at age 18 is happening now at 14, and nobody can put that genie back in the bottle. There's just no way to do it. Too much with internet, with everything else. But if they say no, he's cranky, he's an angry kid, he slams the door, stays in his room, hates school, I say get that kid into treatment right away, because those drugs are going to make that person feel better because they don't feel good. They don't have good hedonic tone. Pets. If any of you had a dog and I would just say the name of your dog, there'd be a big smile on your face. People love their cats, they love their dogs. They're incredible sources of hedonic tone. They never let you down, right? Anytime you want to play with a dog, your hedonic tone goes up. Yeah, that was one of my sources of hedonic tone. His name was Chunky. I had him for 14 years. He was a really good boy. And it was really true. I want to feel better. I just go play with Chunky. The other nice thing about a relationship with dogs is that whenever they want to play with you, you never turn them down like you sometimes do in human relationships, right? Right. Okay. I'm gonna demonstrate hedonic tone for you now, okay? A little demonstration. I'm thinking many of you eat raw carrots. I eat raw carrots. Now, why do I eat a raw carrot? I think it's got less calories than something else I might eat. It's got a lot of fiber. My mother said it was good for vision. I think maybe that's true. I don't know. So I eat raw carrots almost every day. What I want you to do is just for one moment, a couple of seconds, I want you in your mind's eye, think the thought that you're chewing on a raw carrot. Eating a raw carrot, chewing it in your mouth. Just think that thought for a moment. And you'll see that when you think that thought, there's no feeling that accompanies that thought of eating a raw carrot. Whereas, see, if you think about eating this, and even in this non-responsive audience tonight, I did hear some murmurings that when this comes on the screen, I've seen this a million times because I show the slide all the time, I always feel lighter as soon as I see that thing. Now, you don't eat this because it's lowering calories or good for your vision or good fiber. I actually don't know why it's so good. It's the fat, the sugar, but most people love ice cream. And isn't it true that even when you're completely stuffed at a dinner and then somebody says, how about some ice cream? As long as it wasn't a meat dinner, right? How about some ice cream? You say, okay, I've got room for the ice cream, even though I couldn't take another bite of whatever else you were eating. So here, listen, life is short, eat dessert first. You can't argue with that, in my opinion. So what happens to folks when they take a Vicodin? Well, they take it because of pain that they had. They went to the dentist, and we want that Vicodin to work in this part of the brain. This is the area that is good, that the Vicodin should help with pain. But it's going everywhere in the brain, so it's going into that limbic system. And people who are vulnerable with even the first Vicodin or the second Vicodin will say that they feel something special. The vulnerability comes from genetics and environment, like everything else in medicine. The combination of genetics and environment. There are a couple of other things which I'll leave out for today. So how do you understand the genetics and the environment? Well, one way to look at it is that the genes are the bullet in the gun, and the environment pulls the trigger. So you may have a predisposition, but maybe the environment won't make it happen, and nothing will happen to you. The other way to look at the gene and environment interface is that if a little boy looks like his father, that's the genes. If a little boy looks like his next door neighbor, that's the environment. Now, I've called this the exaggerated response. These are my patients in response to the question, what did it feel like the first few times that you used heroin, took a Vicodin. Think back to the first couple of times, what did it feel like? I didn't make this up. This is what they said. All my problems disappeared. I felt like I was under a warm blanket. I'm not going to read this. When I told you when I took the oxycodone, I got nauseous, dizzy, and I wanted to throw up. There's something in a person's brain where this happens to them, and you can have the same stuff with alcohol, and that's the vulnerability. Everyone who gets addicted to opioids says they energized me. That's not supposed to happen. Opioids are depressants, sedative drugs. And they also say that they just like them. So that's vulnerability. Now, we don't know who's vulnerable until they get exposed. 16% of Americans who have mental health disorders receive over half of all the opioids in the United States. So the wrong people are getting them. The drugs are risky. Got to be very careful with them. Smallest amount, shortest amount of time. Children. Let's talk about children a little bit. You all know that it takes a while for an adult brain to become an adult brain. People say the early 20s is when the brain is finally fully developed. And the brain develops from the back to the front, and the front part of the brain is where we have our impulse control, our judgment. It's called the frontal or the prefrontal cortex. That's the last part of the brain that develops. And that's why teenagers who don't have good impulse control are vulnerable to doing risky things that they may regret after they do them, but they don't have that ability to think it through and say, should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And they just go ahead and jump and they do it. And so this is a complicated slide. Just want to show you one or 2 points. This is looking at marijuana. This is looking at alcohol. This is looking at, did they start 14 or younger, 15 to 17, 18 or older? Was their first exposure to either marijuana or alcohol? And then what percent as adults were addicted? And you can see that the earlier a person starts to use the drug or get exposed to it, the more likely they are as an adult to become addicted. So the message of this slide is, if you can just get kids not to use these substances until they're at least 18, 19, 20, and maybe not then either, but younger is not good. Now, of course, if somebody's using drugs at the age of 14, it obviously reflects something terribly wrong in that kid's life, his home, his parents, etc. That's not supposed to happen. Parental absence, and all kinds of things. Dr. Gluck made reference to a very, very important thing, sexual abuse, incest, that kind of stuff. Tremendous vulnerability for addiction. Now, my colleague P.A. Gorgov over there, physician assistant Gorgov, we work together. I don't have any children. You probably know that Mrs. Gorgov has the big 5, right? Everybody know that about you, Mrs. Gorgov? Yeah? So I asked her for recommendations, and she said the following. These are her recommendations. For each kid, 15 minutes of daily conversation with each child, discussing events of the day, explore their feelings. Lots of I love yous, hugs and kisses. Assure the child they have a safe haven in the home. Don't overreact to their actions. Limited TV and internet. No social media. Be a role model. Lead by example, not by precept. In other words, don't be a hypocrite. If you're telling them not to do it, you got to be a model and show them that you're not doing it as well. I would say the same thing would go here for smoking. If you're smoking, don't expect your kids not to smoke. Schedule frequent activities, lunch park, visits. Know your child's friends. This is so important. My mother, I could hear her in my head a million times about my friends, staying away from bad friends. Lock all medications. This is really important. The word medication cabinet on top of the sink, that's gone. Forget about it. That's history. You've got to put these medications in a locked box so that kids can't get to them and visiting kids can't get to them. Dispose of all the medications. There are a number of ways to do it, but flushing medicines down the toilet is perfectly okay. As soon as you don't need them, flush them. Don't save them. People get a hold of them somehow. Don't be ashamed to reach out for help if you expect there's an addiction problem. And introduce reasonable and fair drug and alcohol conversation in the preteen years so your kids have a reasonable and rational idea of what these drugs are about. So we made a scenario here. Your 14-year-old son tells you he smoked marijuana, had a glass of vodka while visiting his friends. The parent, stay calm, don't get angry. How did the drugs make you feel? What was the source of the drugs? Continue with education. Be truthful about the dangers. Some experimental drug use is common and generally doesn't lead to addiction. That's true. Putting it all together, how do we treat opioid addiction? Well, counterintuitively, we have good treatment for opioid addiction, better than for alcohol and cocaine and other addictions. We use Methadone, we use buprenorphine, we use a drug called naltrexone. We like to add psychosocial therapy, psychotherapy into the mix if possible. That says the same thing. When people are on methadone or buprenorphine, if that should occur in your situation, and they're doing well taking those medications regularly, those are opiates, but they're not addicted to them any longer. They're physically dependent, but not addicted. That's a very important distinction. If somebody's doing well on their buprenorphine, you may know it as Suboxone, they're taking it, their urines are negative for all illicit drugs, they're going to school, they're working, they're not addicted, they're physically dependent, which is a big difference than being addicted. All treatments work for some people. No one treatment works for everyone. It may take a few rounds of treatment to find the right treatment, but don't keep repeating the same treatment that fails. Get a new treatment next time. There's an organization called JACS, Jewish Alcoholics, Chemically Dependent Persons. Is that part of what you do too, Dr. Gluck, with JACS? I called up their phone number just to make sure it was really happening, and there's an answer there, a voicemail with all kinds of different suggestions as to what you can do. We don't want people to relapse. Relapses can be deadly, especially with the fentanyl right now. When you send somebody to detox, don't think that that's treatment. That's only getting them off the drug without them going into withdrawal. Detox usually lasts 5 to 7 days, inpatient, outpatient. But as soon as the detox is over, the disease is waiting for them, and they're very likely to relapse without more definitive treatment. Methadone and buprenorphine are both okay to take in pregnancy. Surgeon General said it was a disease. Methadone and buprenorphine are great. AA, Dr. Gluck mentioned AA. I do a different talk with Jewish issues, and there's a lot in AA of the 12 steps there that mirror a lot in Judaism. Same idea, same concept, so it's very compatible with Jewish thought. You go to AA, you take it sincerely, you get a sponsor, you're really into it, people can do well. Why is everything we're talking about so important? Some of you may know Philip Seymour Hoffman, great actor. I think he won 2 Oscars. He died a couple of years ago. Had a major drug overdose, including heroin. He was a major AA person his whole life, suffered with addiction his whole life, did great on AA, would relapse, then do great again. And he was found with a strip of Suboxone in his apartment, using it for withdrawal. But he really didn't have to die. He just wasn't on appropriate treatment. Let me leave you with an upbeat message here. This is a church, not a synagogue, someplace. Monday, Alcoholics Anonymous. Tuesday, abused spouses. Wednesday, eating disorders. Thursday, say no to drugs. Friday, Teen Suicide Watch. Saturday is a soup kitchen. And then Sunday, America's Joyous Future. Thank you very much.